Now, Kholood, we've known Kholood for some time. She was here, St. Antony's, at the Africa Study Center, and I had the pleasure of teaching her for a term. Now she is part of, the upcoming young, what they call startup people, in relation to advice and international organizations. So, Kholood, we will be very grateful for your take on, after you arrived here in this country from Khartoum and you have seen what happened. So I leave the floor for you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. I'm always bemused when people say that I represent the young, because at almost 40, I think I'm probably past that. But and not to make this a family affair after a wonderful presentation. But there are a few things I'd like to highlight, which are we have to see this war, and I will use the term war rather than conflict, as two simultaneous wars being fought. We have the one that we discuss most often, which is the RSF and Sudan Armed Forces. And we have the war that's been waged for a very long time, but has recently gone up a notch, which is the war against civilian politics. This goes to Mehdi's question of why is Khartoum being leveled? Why is there so much destruction being wrought by both sides in this conflict? And the answer is this is intentional. They want to create a tabula rasa, a clean slate, upon which both generals and their junior partners, bearing in mind it's not just the two of them, wherein which they can create or consolidate a new Sudan under their own vision, in their own image. And we know that these generals and their junior partners led a coup together in 2021, but they had very different visions about how to consolidate this coup. And actually, this is what has led us to the war that we're currently in. It's not, issues of integration. It's not even the issue of, the hierarchy of a sovereign or military council. Those are symptoms of the larger issue of how to reconcile these two very different visions with two very different protagonists. And so as long as those two visions cannot be reconciled, of course, the answer is quite obvious to us that neither general can vote. Actually, both, 15th of April was ushered in a new period, I think, where it's become absolutely clear and absolutely obvious that neither general now has the legitimacy to be able to create any kind of government in any future political dispensation in Sudan. So the silver lining is then, this leaves, for the first time, a lot more room to discuss the potential for a fully civilian government that could actually bring about the kind of dismantling of the military project that we've been wanting to see for a long time. Burhan and Hemeti are part of the same military project. They are two factions of the same military project. So neither can be a doing for democracy. And quite clearly, neither can be a doing for stability, because their way of reconciling their differences or fighting out their differences is to level the country, not just Khartoum, of course, but Darfur and elsewhere. Because Sudan has had this legacy of unresolved conflicts, we can see in Darfur what happens when the current conflict is superimposed on top of that. What we're witnessing right now, and we aren't actually able to witness it all that well because of the communications blackout, is what has been described by some as levels of atrocities that are worse than 2003. And that should make us stop and think that this conflict, as we're seeing it between generals and on civilian politics, it has gone up several notches. This is not what we're used to seeing before. But quickly, I want to say that the war on civilian politics is one that we've seen from both sides being fought. First, when they realized that actually they couldn't overpower popular democracy very quickly in 2019, resulting in the June 3rd massacre. And then in several instances where they have leveraged all of their money, all of their foreign friends to minimize the role that civilians can play. I mean, we've heard from the international community several times that civilians can't rule, civilians are divided, civilians can't agree. I would say the same about the military. And yet, they have always been, to some degree, entrusted with some authority over Sudan. And I'd much rather take my chances over a divided civilian government than a divided military government, because we know now very clearly what the consequences are. And of course, as was highlighted before, particularly by my mother, these things, this conflict was a long time coming. And I think we could all see the writing on the wall. And it is criminal that nothing was done about it. And actually nothing is being done about it that is significant, that is meaningful until now. The other thing I'd just quickly like to say is in answer to our friend from Morocco, I believe, which is that you said, is there a charismatic leader that could lead Sudan out of this issue? And the answer is no, and there shouldn't be. There shouldn't be a single charismatic leader to lead Sudan out of this issue, because several reasons. One, we know that no single Sudanese person could guide Sudan with myriad problems out of the current predicament it's in. Secondly, Sudan has had one of the most sustained, robust, independent pro-democracy movement that is led by a collective, and whittling that down to one singular individual, charismatic or otherwise, would be a mistake. Because all it takes, as we have seen in other contexts, as we have seen in Sudan's history, is for that one person to be detained or assassinated, and these movements tend to falter or stop. The main reason that pro-democracy movement, resistance committees, unions and others have maintained their momentum through thick and thin, through a pandemic, through a coup, through a revolution, and after a war, is that they have not settled for a singular leader to guide them through, that they have relied on each other, that they have relied on consensus building and coalition building at the heart of the political project in which they are undertaking. And that is a singular, to me, silver lining in all of this. That once Burhan and Hamidi have done their best and others have done their best to level the country, neither of them can rule. There is no winning here for either of them. Whichever one of them declares victory, which is a very different thing to winning, whichever of them declares victory will have a very difficult time overcoming the pro-democracy movement in all its guises. And so, as someone made the comment earlier, that no military side in Sudan has ever won, no rebel or armed group has ever won without some kind of agreement, so too Burhan and Hamidi will come to the belated realization that they can't either. But they cannot feature in a future political dispensation, because that will weaken any government that will take shape, which will immediately lose legitimacy. This goes too for the armed groups and for the political parties who have made their bets. They, before this conflict broke out, partly because they were forced to by a very flawed political process, that they have chosen each a general. And that was the wrong bet, because choosing a general meant turning their backs on the street, and turning their backs on pro-democracy, non-violent politics that has been the most successful so far at bringing about political change. So we have to think of a new Sudan, a civilian Sudan, and there are many people who are doing that as we speak, under fire, without electricity, without water, without hope, frankly. And as Dr. Asada, who's no longer with us right now, said earlier, yes, we can try, yes, we can try and overcome what is happening, but we cannot be beholden to the despair, because there is so much at stake, and despite how despondent we can all become, there is now a greater chance than ever to bring about a fully civilian democracy. And democracy is not a final destination, it is a journey, but it's also happening. We have seen democracy, I don't mean elections because they are just sort of procedural elements of democracy. But we have seen this play out. We've seen this play out in the ways that people continue to agitate, in the ways that people continue to share resources, in the way people continue to use mutual aid to help each other, even while being killed, even while being detained, even while being tortured. And that is the thing that's going to bring Sudan over. Not any kind of quick, pragmatic, quote-unquote, contract or agreement with any general, and not any kind of reliance on the old tenets of Sudanese politics that have been incredibly militarized and frankly haven't gotten us to where we need to go. So I'll leave it there, otherwise I could go on forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the last question is going to have from Rosalind, please, and then we will close the conference. Rosalind, please.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted really to respond to what Kholood said.
Yes.
I think, well, first of all, to say I very much agree, obviously, with key point you made that this war isn't just a power struggle between two crazy generals, it's also a war on civilian politics. I think that's certainly absolutely true. And secondly, I think many people would agree, that almost everyone, that after destroying the country, it's quite clear that these two generals and their institutions can't be given any future role in the governance of the country. Interestingly, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, in his message to the Sudanese people, has now changed sort of US policy by saying that the Americans want to see a civilian government. The African Union that wants to take the lead in any expanded negotiations is still unfortunately talking about a civilian-led government. So I hope that the AU will catch up with the Western actors on that. But the point I perhaps wanted to take issue with Kholood on was this reference to student politics being a dichotomy between, the Islamist South versus a democratizing rapid support force. I don't think anyone, perhaps except the most die-hard RSF supporters, would see the RSF's position as anything but tactical. I mean, what we do know is that the Pulse Committee joined Burhan in carrying out the coup of October 2021 against the civilians. I think he then realised that this also had led to the return of a large number of members of the old regime and Islamists who posed a threat to himself because they saw him as having betrayed Bashir. And for tactical reasons, he then turned to the civilians to try to make them an ally. In June 2022, he admitted in a BBC interview that the coup had been a mistake. So I think it was quite clear he was doing this for tactical reasons. At the same time, General Burhan, perhaps listening to the Egyptians, I don't know, was doing his best to water down the framework agreement by calling for the inclusion of groups who had supported the October 21 coup and parties who had been aligned with the old regime. Now, it's interesting that following the war, the Sudanese Army military intelligence and the Islamists have been targeting, in particular, the political leaders of the FFC Central Council. So clearly, they saw them as a considerable threat. And in the months leading up to the war, we saw members of the old regime calling for mobilizing, calling a call for action and trying to say they wanted to undermine the framework agreement. So I would just conclude by pointing out that the FFC Central Council has made very clear since the war started that they're supporting a no to war campaign, that they're not taking sides. Some of their leaders have publicly condemned violations by both sides, including the Rapid Support Force. They've acknowledged that the two sides went to war to protect their political and economic interests. And it was also the FFC Central Council who were the first to call for a single national professional army removed from politics. That was part of the Juba Peace Agreement as well. So I think just to sort of set the balance, just to sort of set out that side of the story, but I think it's overwhelmingly true that in any future discussions, obviously the civilian base has to be broadened. A much greater effort has to be made to bring in the resistance committees, women's groups, and all those other pro-democracy groups in any future discussions.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. We close this by thanking you all, very much for participating in this really very worthwhile event during very difficult time of Sudan modern history. We don't know how it's going to shape in the very near future. We have no idea, but let us hope that the two sides will come to their senses, if they have any sense, is to stop killing, to stop looting, to stop destroying people's property, because that's not good in the long run. If they go on like this, the fracture will be deeper and deeper and will be very difficult to heal in the future. But thank you very much for all your questions and presence. Thank you very much for coming.